Mark Pope's departure has been the big headline around BYU basketball this offseason, but new coach Kevin Young has put together a roster that can challenge the powers that be in the Big 12 Conference.
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, folks? Happy Wednesday and welcome into the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, a daily national college hoop show, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am your solo host today, Andy Patton. You are joining us at the place to get your college basketball content every single day, not just from November through March, but we are talking college basketball 5 days per week, every single week of the year. I want to give a special shout out to our everyday listeners and those of you who have joined our Discord channel. It is free to join. There is a link in the show notes on both audio and video platforms. Bunch of college basketball nuts hanging out, talking hoops all the time. All right, folks. We are talking BYU basketball today. They make another big addition on the recruiting trail. Talk about what that means for Kevin Young's team. The Zags have finalized their roster with an international big man. We'll talk about that. And then we're closing out the show, folks. Joe Lunardi is at it again. Another Bracketology update here in mid-June. We're going to talk about what he thinks and kind of process all of that here to close out the show. We start in Provo, Utah. More headlines around BYU basketball in the last few months than there have been in many years. And that's no disrespect to the BYU programs of the past. But again, 2 years ago, they were the fifth place team in the WCC, finishing behind Gonzaga and St. Mary's, which is no shame in that, but also finishing behind, I believe it was Santa Clara and either San Francisco or LMU that clipped them in that final year before they moved to the Big 12. They moved to the Big 12 last year, have a fair amount of success in the new league, very talented roster. And then suddenly Mark Pope gets plucked away to go to his alma mater, Kentucky. And since then, it has been a whirlwind for BYU. But Kevin Young, the new head coach, made yet another big-time addition. Reported on Tuesday that they have landed a commitment from 2024 four-star wing Kanon Catchings. Catchings is a 6'9" forward. He's initially from Indianapolis, but he played his high school basketball, or is playing his high school basketball at Overtime Elite. He was the 39th ranked player in the class using On3's composite rankings. Looking at those composite rankings, he was as high as 30th at Rivals. He was 35th at ESPN. He was 38th at 24/7 Sports, and he was 47th in the class at On3. So a consensus top 50 prospect. Most places have him in that 30 to 40 range. And Catchings wasn't a prospect really on the radar because he committed to Purdue way back after his sophomore season of high school. And back in 2022, he was committed to Matt Painter and the Boilermakers and stayed committed to them until about a month ago. Suddenly, Kanon Catchings back available on the recruiting trail. He visited Florida State, Coach Leonard Hamilton. He visited NC State, who went to the Final Four last year in a shocking run for Kevin Keats' team. He visited BYU and ultimately lands in the Big 12 with the Cougars. Catchings is the nephew of Tamika Catchings, one of the greatest WNBA players in the sport's history. His mom and his grandpa also played professional basketball, has significant basketball bloodlines. He is a projected one-and-done talent. Listed at 6'9", I've seen other places list him at 6'10". He is a long, rangy wing, extremely high-level athlete, the kind of player that NBA scouts are drooling over these days. And instead of landing at the traditional powers, or even landing at Purdue, where they have been churning out NBA talent and obviously been a high-profile program the last half decade or so, instead of ending up there, he ends up in Provo with BYU. And he's not the only one. Kevin Young, who's an assistant coach for the Phoenix Suns, comes over to take over this program, leaves the NBA, has said in press conferences that he would rather be coaching at the college level than the NBA level, whereas a lot of the discourse around college basketball the last month or so in light of the Dan Hurley situation has been whether it is preferred to coach in college or in the NBA. And Kevin Young said, I want that challenge. I want to recruit. I want to develop young minds. I want to be able to navigate the transfer portal and NIL and recruit high school recruiting and see what I can do. And all he's done so far is put together what is universally considered the best recruiting class in BYU basketball history. He has added player. I think every time BYU adds a new player, there's a conversation of like, is this the highest rated recruit in BYU history? At 24/7 Sports, I think at least two, maybe even three of the players BYU has brought in have been the highest rated recruit in BYU history. They keep resetting the record. And some of that was going to happen organically with this team's move to the Big 12. Like if Mark Pope was still here, they probably would have started landing some of the highest rated recruits in program history. If another coach took over, that probably would have happened. But that doesn't take away from what Kevin Young has done, because they have two legitimate one and done caliber talents on this roster. That is not something that happens for BYU very often. We talked about Kanon Catchings, who has that one and done potential because of his length, his range, his bloodlines, his size, all that good stuff. They also had Egor Demin from Russia. 6'8" guard coming over from Russia, widely considered a potential first-round pick in the 2025 draft. Lots of speculation of where he'd end up. He's also going to Provo to play for the Cougars. So you got Egor Demin coming over. You've got Kanon Catchings, a decommit who's now committed to the program. Two potential one-and-done talent, two guys who are going to, if not start, at least play big minutes right away for Kevin Young's team. And they join a class that already had some pretty tremendous talent. Elijah Crawford was a decommit from Stanford who comes to BYU. He's number 88th ranked player in the class, the 2024 class, according to On3, a 6'2" point guard. They also have a 6'7" wing from Salt Lake joining the program in Brody Kozlowski, 149th in the class. They also have a 6'4" shooting guard from Keller, Texas, Brooks Barr, who's 111th in the class, according to 24/7 Sports. He's unranked at some of the other recruiting services, but there's at least one service that has him as a borderline top 100 player. So certainly a quality, if that's your fifth player in your recruiting class, that is a pretty excellent player to have coming into the program in that position, in that spot. So you got 5 newcomers coming in, 2 who are projected to be one and done talents. You also have a pair of transfers coming in, 2 big men, one Mewat Mag coming over from Rutgers, only played 17 games last year because of injury, but averaged about 10 points, about 4 boards, 1.2 steals. You also have Keba Keita joining the program from Utah, guy who played at Wasatch Academy in Utah, one of the premier kind of West Coast basketball factories, high school basketball factories. Spent the last couple of years at Utah. Last year averaged about 8.5 points, 5.5 rebounds. So you get 2 veteran big men transferring into your program, helps replace some of the losses that they had in the front court. You get 5 exciting freshmen coming in, again, 2 of them who could be one and dones in this program. And despite all of that, in a year where you have a coaching change and you have a bunch of newcomers, typically part of that conversation is the losses, the departures. Oh, you look at Kentucky, you look at Arkansas, you look at Louisville, some of the other programs that had coaching changes, and they brought in huge classes, huge transfer portal classes, but they lost everybody. BYU didn't. They had some tough losses. Spencer Johnson's out of eligibility. He was a great player for them. Jackson Robinson transferred to Kentucky. That was a very notable storyline this offseason. Ali Khalifa and Noah Waterman both transferred to Louisville to play for Pat Kelsey. Atiki Ali Atiki, went to New Mexico, transferred there. Marcus Adams Jr. transferred to Cal State Northridge. But at the end of the day, this team kept Trevin Nell. They kept Dallin Hall. They kept Richie Saunders. They kept Fusini Traore. They kept Dawson Baker, who only played about 5 games last year, but was a transfer that they got from the Big West, who was expected to be a big-time contributor. Now he's fully healthy after that foot injury. He could be a big-time player for this team. For Kevin Young and BYU to have this kind of recruiting class, to have made quality additions in the transfer portal, and to have, they lost some talent, but to retain as much of the talent as they did in a year with a coaching change is remarkable. At a school like BYU, frankly, it's unprecedented. Now we have the conversation about what does this team look like in an incredibly competitive Big 12 conference. And it's very similar to the conversation Isaac and I had earlier this week about Kansas State, because Kansas State has had a tremendous offseason as well. More so on the transfer portal side of things, of course, than on the recruiting side. But Jerome Tang's team is loaded with transfers, veteran guys ready to help right away. Here's the thing about the Big 12. There are 5 teams that are going to be really tough to crack if you want to be a top 5 team in this conference. You got to beat one of Kansas, Houston, Iowa State, Baylor, and Arizona. That is a really great group of teams. Kansas retained some key pieces, brought in some of the best transfers in the country. Houston, similar situation, didn't quite do as well in the transfer portal, but brought some key guys in and retained a bunch of talent. Terrence Arsenault won't be hurt next year. That's a huge addition for them. Iowa State keeps basically their entire core together, adds Joshua Jefferson. Love that move for them. Baylor, You get Norchad O'Meara, you get VJ Edgecombe, you get Jeremy Roach. Really great 3 players coming to that program. Arizona's done a lot of rebuilding, but they get Caleb Love back. They got some really nice players in the portal as well. Going to be tough to crack that top 5. Outside of that, I think BYU's in that conversation. 6, 7, 8. Them, I think Kansas State's in that conversation. I think Texas Tech is in that conversation. I think outside of that, you get Cincinnati, TCU, kind of maybe rounding out the top 10 of that conference. Then beyond that, that's where you get to teams that would be a bit more surprising if they were in that conversation. Let's put it that way. That's your Colorados, your Arizona States, Utah, Central Florida, West Virginia, programs of that ilk. But even if BYU finishes 6th, 7th, 8th, 8th might be a bit of a disappointment. If they finish 6th or 7th in the conference this year with this roster, put some guys in the NBA, they are building something right now that could be really, really big time for this program in Provo going forward. Well, folks, we're going to go from a former WCC school to a current WCC school as Few and Gonzaga finalize their roster with an up-and-coming big man out of Europe, and we're going to talk about that in just a second. Right after I tell you about today's sponsor, eBay Motors. Folks, passion, drive, patience, that's the formula for winning championships, and it's also what helps keep your ride or die alive. And eBay Motors has everything that you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. From superchargers to roof racks, exhaust kits to LED headlights, and more. Whether you are into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. And with over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. Plus, with eBay's guaranteed fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your car every time or you get your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. So with all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home that W. So keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply, and eBay's guaranteed fit is only available to U.S. customers. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On College Basketball Podcast. And like I said, moving from one school that used to be in the WCC and BYU, talking about a team that is still currently in the WCC for now. We'll see how long Gonzaga sticks around in that West Coast Conference. But what we do know about Few and the Zags is their roster is full. In an era where a lot of teams are not signing all 13 scholarships or not assigning them all to different players, Few and the Zags did. Ismaila Diagne becomes the final scholarship player for Few and the Zags for this upcoming 24-25 season. He made the announcement on Instagram Monday morning. Diagne is a 7-foot, 17-year-old center playing with the Real Madrid program. He is initially from Senegal. He has been playing with Real Madrid's youth league for a long time. I don't know exactly when he started, but he's been in that system pretty much since he's been a basketball player. Last year, for Real Madrid's U18 team, at the Adidas Next Generation Tournament, Diagne averaged 10.2 points, a little under 8 rebounds, and 1.5 assists per game. He put up similar numbers for them throughout the season as well. He also got a brief chance to play with the national team. He's one of the youngest players to get a chance to play for Real Madrid's, their elite team, their national team. In that, he played about 12.5 minutes per game, averaged 5 points, 4.5 boards, and 1 block. There's not a lot of playing time that is going to be available for Ismaila Diagne in his freshman season at Gonzaga. But what I love about Few's offseason is he went out and filled all 13 scholarships knowing darn well that he's going to maybe play 9 guys a night. Few, like many elite college basketball coaches like Bill Self and Hubert Davis and others, tends to be pretty conservative with bench usage. Few's going to play 8 guys. He might play 9. They have the depth this year to go 9 deep. But instead of not filling those final spots, they went out and got a full 13-man roster. That includes Braden Smith, the Colgate transfer point guard who's from Seattle, who voluntarily committed to Gonzaga to redshirt next season so that he can replace Ryan Nembhard as the team's starting point guard in the 2025-26 season. Players are not voluntarily redshirting very often. Braden Smith could have committed to Cal, who was invested in him, probably gone to Cal, played good minutes, made decent money, and then hit the transfer portal again next season and came to Gonzaga. But Few convinced him, no, we want you to learn our offense. We want you to go against Ryan Nembhard and Nolan Hickman in practice and be ready to take over this team on day one. Few and the Zags go out and get Emmanuel Innocente, an Italian guard who played last year at Tarleton State, 6.5 points, 6.5 boards, about 3.5 assists. He's not going to play much next year. They don't have the room for him to play, but he's got 3 years of eligibility. A guy who's going to sit in the system, learn, develop behind the scenes, and be ready to take on a bigger role after this upcoming season. You also now get Diagne, 17-year-old 7-footer, one of the youngest players to play in the highest level of the European League. Guy who's shown a lot of promise as a rim runner, as a shot blocker, high-level athlete. Mark Few recently compared him to Ronny Turiaf. Pretty great comparison if you're talking about international bigs who've played at Gonzaga. But he's not going to play much next year. Graham Ike is the potential All-American center in the front court. Michael Ajayi, who just pulled out of the NBA draft, transferred from Pepperdine, averaged 17 and 10 last year, led the WCC in scoring. He's going to play a lot of minutes at the 4, same as Ben Gregg, who's entering his final year of eligibility. Diagne is the 4th big and is probably not going to see a lot of playing time next season. I don't think he'll redshirt because he's already projected as a potential draft pick. Some project him in 2025. That's not going to happen now that he's at Gonzaga because he's not going to play enough to get that kind of attention, but maybe he's a 2026 draft pick. Kind of depends on if Graham Ike comes back. Graham Ike technically has another year of eligibility after this upcoming season. Most expect he will not use it. In that case, Braden Huff probably steps into the starting center role, but Diagne plays either alongside him at power forward or they find a way to make that lineup work with the 2 big guys. But regardless, Diagne is not a player who's going to need all 4 years, so I don't think they're going to burn a red shirt on him. I don't think that's necessary. But regardless, he's not going to play a lot of minutes next year, but he's going to get a chance to learn the system. He's not even coming to campus until the fall. The latest update as I'm recording this right now on Tuesday evening is that he's not going to be on campus till like September when school starts. So they're not going to turn around and put him into a rotation right away. But he's another developmental piece for Mark Few and the Zags. Another player to learn behind the scenes. Gonzaga has been elite at this for 20 plus years. Dan Dickau transferred to Gonzaga from Washington, sat out a year, became an All-American. That was 20 years ago. Nigel Williams-Goss, almost exact same story. Transferred from Washington, sat out a year. One of the best point guards in college basketball, led Gonzaga to the national championship in 2017. Kyle Wiltshire transferred from Kentucky, sat out a year. One of the best players in college basketball. Brandon Clark, San Jose State, transferred to Gonzaga, sat out a year. Became the most productive big man in college basketball over Zion Williamson in that 2018-2019 season. He was an absolute beast for Gonzaga that year. There's 2 things Gonzaga's great at. Developing players behind the scenes, either with redshirt years or just not getting a lot of playing time, and international big men. Mark Few compared him to Ronny Turiaf. Could have compared him to Domantas Sabonis, Shemek Karnowski, Killian Tilly, Filip Petrusev. International bigs thrive at Gonzaga. Players who come to Gonzaga and sit for a year or 2 thrive at Gonzaga. There's a lot of option and a lot of expectation that Ismaila Diagne, who's just committed to Gonzaga, could be the next in a long line of very successful bigs in this program. Not going to see it next year, but do not be surprised to see him thriving in this program in the not too distant future. Well, folks, Joe Lunardi updated his bracketology. It is mid-June, late June. It's way too early to be doing bracketology, and it's arguably just as early to be talking about somebody else's bracketology in June. But guess what? That's what we're doing. And we're going to get to it here in just a second. All right, folks, segment 3, still Andy Patton, still Locked On College Basketball Podcast, and we are talking bracketology. It's not even July, not even the NBA draft. A lot of rosters are not finalized. We're getting to the point where most rosters are fairly well set. Most teams that are going to make the NCAA tournament have their roster pretty well in hand at this point, but there's still hundreds of good players in the transfer portal still available. There are still some high major programs who have yet to finalize their roster who are going to sign somebody out of the transfer portal in the next week, month, 6 weeks, players who are going to impact those programs in the future. Having said that, the general idea of what these teams are going to look like next season is more or less set. Is it too early to do bracketology? I suppose that depends on each individual opinion. Obviously, yes, it's too early to really have a great sense, but we can project where we kind of see some of these teams landing. And that's what Lunardi did here on his Tuesday bracketology report. I'm going to talk 1 seeds, 2 seeds, a few other notables that stood out to me. We'll talk about the bubble. We'll get you out of here and enjoying the rest of your Wednesday. The 1 seeds from Joe Lunardi: Kansas, Alabama, Houston, and UConn. And you're not going to find any objections from me here. I will say that I'm not 100% sold on UConn yet. Great that Dan Hurley's back. Great that Alex Caravan's back. I like Aiden Mahaney. I don't love Aiden Mahaney as much as others do. I think that it's a big adjustment. Not just St. Mary's is a good program, and the WCC is a good conference. It's less of the jump up level wise and more so just going from the St. Mary's offense and the role he had there to what his role is expected to be at UConn. It's just a very different change. Terrace Reed, I think, is good, but he's not Donovan Kling, he's not Adama Sanogo. It's not fair to say he's going to be those guys, but he's not. And that was a big part of UConn's success the last couple of years. Samson Johnson needs to take a big jump. Hassan Diarra needs to take a jump. Are they capable of it? Sure, of course. Liam McNeely needs to be one of the best freshmen in the country. Is he capable of that? Of course. You just need a lot of things to fall together. And it's not like that's not true of every program at this point. I'm just a little bit more skeptical of UConn. I don't think they're going to be like not make the tournament or be like an 8 seed or something, but I'm not ready to throw them into the fire as a 1 seed yet. But Kansas, Alabama, Houston, love those guys at the top. And I don't really object to UConn. They're just not, they wouldn't be in that spot for me at this point. 2 seeds right now for Joe Lunardi: Auburn, Iowa State, Gonzaga, and Duke. I thought Auburn was a bit of a surprise, but the more I thought about it, I dig it. Brome coming back is a huge returner for them. They got a couple other big pieces coming back as well. This team was very good last year. Obviously suffered an early loss in the NCAA tournament to Yale, but Bruce Pearl's a good coach. Be curious to see if they run a similar 9-10 man rotation next year. But with Broome back in the mix in the front court, I think that team's going to be solid. Iowa State, I talked about them a little bit earlier, return most of their key pieces, get Joshua Jefferson, transfer from St. Mary's. I think they're going to be great. Gonzaga, we just talked about. Duke, depends how great you think Cooper Flagg's going to be. I think Cooper Flagg's going to be great, but is the rest of this team ready? I think the roster construction right now for Duke's a little bit odd, and I'm interested to see how it kind of shakes out for them. There's a lot of riding on some of the transfers they got coming in to be impactful right away. Some of the freshmen are going to have to step up. Doesn't mean it can't happen. I'm not quite so sold on Duke's roster construction at this point, but wouldn't be shocked to see them in this conversation by the time March rolls around. A couple other notables to mention here. Lunardi has Indiana as a 4 seed, one of the teams I am most intrigued by this upcoming season. Indiana kind of followed that mantra of adding a lot of talent in the portal, but do the pieces fit together? And I think some teams can get away with just grabbing talent and figuring it out once you have the talent. There are some coaches that I think are very good at this. We're going to learn if Mark Pope is one of them at Kentucky. We're going to learn if Pat Kelsey is one of them at Louisville. We're going to learn to an extent if Dusty May is one of them at Michigan. I'll be honest, I'm not super sold that Mike Woodson at Indiana is one of them. And I'm also not sold that the pieces that they added fit together all that well. Kanon Carlisle is a good player. He's not much of a shooter. The guard they got from Washington State, whose name is escaping me at this moment, not Miles Rice. Miles Rice, not a great shooter. Umar Ballo, good big man, back to the basket guy, doesn't extend the floor at all. How does that work with the bigs they already have? Mackenzie Mbako comes back. He's not much of a shooter either. Malik Renault, I think floor spacing is going to be an issue for Indiana. And I'm not super confident that Mike Woodson can draw up the offense that fits the pieces they have on this roster, at least not in a way that lends to them being a 4 seed. They have a roster that is talented enough to be a 4 seed. I'm not sure I see it happening for them. Arkansas is a 5 seed. Kentucky's a 6 seed. Really like Arkansas's roster. 6 guys coming over from Kentucky, 3 out of the transfer portal, 3 incoming freshmen. John Calipari's got 6 guys that he's comfortable with, that he's familiar with. He also gets Jonas Adu out of the transfer portal from Tennessee. He gets John L. Davis, one of the best players in the transfer portal, one of the best players in college basketball coming over from FAU. I think John L. Davis and the John Calipari offense is going to be electric. Trevin Brazile comes back. That's a huge returner for Arkansas, even though he's returning to an entirely new roster. I'm sold on Arkansas. I think this could really work, but it's John Calipari, so there's a little bit of skepticism. 5 seed feels about right. Also, putting Arkansas and Calipari on the 5 seed line when 12-5 upsets are trendy picks, feels a little intentional by Lunardi, but hey, the committee might do it anyway. Kentucky's 6 seed. Kentucky's another team that's tough to pin down. A lot of talent on that roster. Nobody who's played together. Mark Pope, good coach, hasn't coached at this level before. Lots of changes. He coached in the Big 12 last year, but he had a roster that he was comfortable with. New roster, new players, coaching in the SEC, coaching in Lexington. I'm a believer in Mark Pope. I have said that on this podcast time and time again, but I'm not sold that next year is immediately going to be great. Having said that, 6 seed doesn't feel that off. Like a 6 seed's not a great season for Kentucky. I think a lot of Big Blue Nation will probably take a 6 seed this year. When you look at the roster and the lack of continuity in any capacity for this team, very intrigued how it's going to work. They got some great shooting. Kirk Kriisa, Kobe Brea, fantastic outside shooting on this roster. Jackson Robinson, of course. They got some good defenders. Lamont Butler, fantastic defensive guard for this team. Some of the big front court guys I think are going to be impactful defenders. So I'm optimistic about this team. 6 seed doesn't feel too bad. I think that's probably a good result if you're a Kentucky fan at this point. But certainly what matters is not what seed you get, it's how you do once you get in the big dance, because that has been the issue for the Wildcats the last couple of years. Lunardi has Michigan versus Kansas State as an 8-9 matchup, which I just wanted to mention because, wow, that would be quite a game. Dusty May, Jerome Tang, two very rebuilt rosters. I could see these teams both kind of floating in that 8-9 range. This actually feels like a potentially realistic matchup and one that might be a really fun one. You guys have noticed that the first game of the day on Thursday in the NCAA tournament is almost always an 8-9 game. Sign me up for Michigan, Kansas State. That's the first game of the big dance next year. Whew, we're going to be in for a really good one. And then one that I think I disagreed with more than anything else, Lunardi had Florida as an 8 seed. I'm a lot higher than that on Florida. I need to redo my top 25 rankings. I'm not sure. I don't think Florida's going to be a top 10 team, but they might be top 20. I'm almost certain I'll have them in the top 25. I wouldn't be surprised to see Florida as a 4 seed. And part of it is injuries in the front court. Micah Handlockton with the situation there, but they get Alex Condon. He's really good as a freshman last year. I think he's going to develop even more so as a sophomore. They get a transfer, Washington State big man transferring in. I think he's a quality piece for them to have. And the guard room is just really, really good with the players they have back, the players they have coming in. I'm a lot more optimistic about Florida than Lunardi is if he's got him as an 8 seed for next season. And I'll quickly rattle off the teams on the bubble. Last 4 byes for Lunardi: Illinois, Clemson, Rutgers, and USC. Illinois definitely stands out there. Yes, they lost Terrence Shannon Jr. and Coleman Hawkins, but wow, that would be quite a fall for Brad Underwood's team. Last 4 in: St. Mary's, Pitt, Louisville, and Providence. Would be very cool to see Pat Kelsey make the big dance in his first season with that program. Definitely feels possible, although going to be a tough sell. First 4 out: Oregon, Mizzou, Maryland, and Vanderbilt. I like the offseason Oregon has had, but not getting N'Faly Dante back definitely hurts. Would be nice to see Mizzou bounce back after a disastrous season under Dennis Gates last year. Vanderbilt is a bit of a surprise here. Would be fun to see Mark Byington, the coach from James Madison, who's taken over the program. Would be fun to see him get this program back to NCAA tournament relevancy. And then next 4 out: Nebraska, VCU, Villanova, St. Louis. Kyle Neptune doesn't make the big dance in year 3. I think it's going to be his final year coaching the Wildcats. I don't think that's even remotely a hot take at this point. Pair of A-10 schools in VCU and St. Louis. I didn't notice who he had getting the automatic qualifier out of the A-10, whether he's got Davidson repeating even with the loss of Deron Holmes. Maybe he's got Richmond doing it. Who knows? But VCU and St. Louis are 2 teams that are certainly going to be in the mix for that automatic qualifying bid in the A-10. And apparently, according to Lunardi, could be in the mix for a at-large bid as well. Folks, that's going to wrap it up for me today here on the Locked On College Basketball Podcast. Thank you so much to those of you who have made this show your first listen or your first watch of the day. Reminder to check out the show on YouTube. Hit that subscribe button if you have not done so yet. We'll be back on Thursday with more conversation about transfer portal updates, recruiting updates, the NBA draft coming up. Isaac and I will be back on Friday with some fun stuff for you as well. Thanks again, and until next time, as always, peace out.